Probably change his tires if not.
Alright. Okay, Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph. Today also is the day we commemorate Yom HaShoah. It actually fell out yesterday, but anyway, so obviously, our learning should be L'Zecher Nishmas, all of those who perished in the Holocaust. We pick up with Lamed Amud Bet, the Lukoim Beis HaPras. So we're now dealing with, again, the question about where you put the Eruv. Where you put the Eruv, and or what the Eruv is made out of, and we dealt with the issue about that it has to be 2 meals worth. You know, what's considered, how much food is that? Is it subjective? Is it a more universal standard? And then specifically the position of sumchis, it has to be able to be eaten by the person himself or herself who's putting the Eruv, not just by somebody else. And now we turn to the question about the location, because the Mishnah had dealt with the issue about a Kohen putting it in a place where a Kohen normally couldn't go, a Beis HaPras, which is a field that was plowed over, a grave was plowed over, and there are little bits of bone throughout it, and it says you can put it for a Kohen there, and now the Gemara discusses why. A person can, who needs to cross, meaning a Kohen, a Beis HaPras, can sort of blow, and go. So like you blow the dirt right in front of you, and you see that there is that there's no what do you call it? That there are no chips of bone, and then you go it. Okay. Okay, so now the Gemara says, so therefore, theoretically, it would be possible to access it. Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami Mishmei Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beis HaPras Shenidash Tahor. Once we're talking about this, there are times where if it's actually been trampled through and people have made a path through it, then it's Tahor, because then you could assume that any little chips of bone that were on that path have already been crushed. I don't exactly know why you can assume that, like little things can get lodged into the dirt and not get crushed by people walking on them. But anyway, the point is it's theoretically possible by blowing to get through the Beis HaPras, and therefore it is considered accessible by the Kohen. Now we turn to the position of Rabbi Yehuda, who says not only a Beis HaPras, but even a Kohen can even put his Eruv in a cemetery, in a Beis HaKvarot. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Beis HaKvarot. Tana, why is this? So the Brite explains, because the Mishnah just said because you can make a chatzitza, you can make a division and go, but the Brite explains that you can do it in some type of a box or a tower, meaning you can basically put yourself in like a carriage and be carried through, and therefore the fact that there'll be a floor underneath you will be a chatzitza. So if you happen to go over any graves, the tumor will stop. You understand? You're like in a carriage, so like a wagon, as it were. So therefore, any tumor that you'll go over will stop by the underside of the floor, and therefore it's theoretically possible for a Kohen to get there. It's assuming that the Eruv is not on a grave itself. The Eruv is, let's say, between graves, or in a tree. But how do you get through a cemetery to get to it? It's also assuming, right, that this is also an interesting point. It's also assuming that you don't have overhangs, I guess, because if you had overhangs, you were just assuming about the problem that you'll walk over a grave. So if you're being carried in a wagon, the tumor underneath will hit the floor of the wagon. It doesn't deal with the problem that if you have like an overhang. So it's probably assuming that you're not having overhangs. Yes.
That's why Kohanim sometimes wear barrels around them when they go into a. They put a barrel around.
I don't understand how that works.
They're like their feet are walking, but it's somehow they do something. But
I don't understand how the barrel addresses this.
They make a barrier around.
Oh, that's a different issue, because you're not supposed to be within 4 amos of a grave. So that's maybe just to keep them away from 4 amos of the grave. Yeah. But here there's a concern that, so that might be what that's about.
You know where the graves are today.
Right, they're well marked. Right, exactly. Yeah.
Some people do that.
So when they go to the cover of the grave of the Rabbi,
Yeah.
Even though he didn't die, they go to his grave. And the Kohanim wear this thing around them.
Right. Interesting. Okay. All right. So there's a way to get there. It is possible that it also deals with the overhang as well. I'm just thinking, because if it has a roof, then it's a separate space, so even if there's a roof on top of it, probably would deal with the overhang as well, because it's not a kli. Rashi makes the point that this wagon, or whatever, this box that you're in, is more than 40 sa'ah, which takes it out of the category of a kli. So you're protected both from the underneath, and if you got a roof on top, you're protected from the overhang. So therefore you would be totally safe. You would go into like this, in through this self-contained unit. So the Gemara says, and therefore, so what's the debate? So why do the rabbis disagree? So the Gemara says, Kasavar Oel Zoruk Shmei Ohel, because it's of the opinion that a thrown Ohel is an Ohel, which basically means a Ohel that is not stationary. I mean, one thing you could imagine is, you throw a plank through the sky, and it happens to pass over my head, right? And and there's tumah underneath, so it could be both l'chum or l'kula. Does it carry the tumah? If there's a mace over here and there's a flying plank in the sky, shoo, right? And as it's passing over my head, does it transfer the tumah if it's not stationary? Or in the other case, does it stop the tumah, right? If you have something flying here, now actually a good example of that is a airplane. Right, airplanes, which very often airports are made near cemeteries, and airplanes fly over the cemetery. So that seems like a great example of an old zoruk. Does it stop the tumah, or does it go through? Also, airplanes are made out of metal, and metal is in chotetz bifnei tumah. So a lot of questions about how Kohanim can fly in airplanes that take off from certain airports, which we're not going to get to right now. But anyway, that's the question about thrown. So this is a lot of airports. So this is not literally thrown; it's being carried, but it's not like in a fixed place. Okay, and that's the question, whether that's considered to be an ohel, and would that be a way of getting through the cemetery? Ubeplugsa dahani tanai, and it connects to the debate of the following tanaim. The time to Brisa. Hanichnas le'eretz ha'amim b'sheidat tevu migdal. Somebody goes into the non-Jewish land, outside of the land of Israel, where they treated it as tamei, and therefore Kohanim actually were not allowed to leave the land of Israel. And different opinions about how tamei they treated, but according to one, they treated it as if it was tumas ohel, as if there was the ground was tamei, and it caused as if it was graves buried there. So therefore, if you went there, b'sheidat tevel migdal, if you went though in a box or in some type of a carriage, Rabbi mitamei, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda mitaher. So Rabbi says it's your tamei, and Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says your tahor. B'mai kamifli. What's the debate about? Masav ol zork lav shmei ol, masav ol zork shmei oel. Okay, so this debate about whether when it's being carried, it's not in a fixed place, is that an oel to stop the tumah underneath it? Now, I wanted to make a point. Okay, so this is the debate. And the question is it possible for a Kohen to get to the Eruv or not? But everybody agrees that if the Kohen can't get to the Eruv, it's no good. Why not? So if you take a look at Rashi says, Shmei Ohel, there are 4 lines from the bottom. Rashi says, 3 lines from the bottom, last one on the line. V'rabbanan demasnisin karebi svir lahu, ubein Rabbi Yehuda, ubein Rabbanan kesumcha svir le. So this problem that you have to be able to get to your Eruv, and if it's in the cemetery, it's a problem. It says goes like sumchis. Amar midi dechazi le lemech le bahu shaita beinan. You need something that's able to be eaten. Right? Remember, sumcha says a Kohen can't use truma. You have to be able to eat it. So Rashi says this idea that you have to get to the food is part of Sumchas's idea that you have to be able to eat it, you have to be able to get to it. But if you held like the rabbis that said a Kohen can use truma, so why not put something in a cemetery? You don't have to be able to get to it, somebody else can. So Rashi thinks it's connected to Sumchas's idea that you specifically have to be able to eat it. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says there's a difference between eating it and getting to it. He wants to say that everybody would agree you can't say that is where you started Shabbos if you can't get there. Okay, if it's out of reach and you can't get there, then everybody would agree you can't start Shabbos. The debate of Sumchas and the Chachamim was, is it enough that someone can eat it, or do you have to be able to eat it? But everybody, says Tosfos, would agree you have to be able to get there. So Tosfos says this issue of stuff for a Kohen in a cemetery is a problem according to everyone. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. V'had time Rabbi Yehuda Omer. We taught in the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says not just this case of a cemetery, but top of Lamed Aleph, Ma'arvin lekohen tahor b'truma tahora b'kever. That if a Kohen is tahor, you can put Torah truma, not just chulin, right on a grave. Now, of course, the question is, how can you put truma tahora on a grave and it remain tahor? So the Gemara will get to it. But you have Truma tahor right on a grave. So on the one hand, it's more problematic because it's right on the grave, and we're talking about truma. And if truma becomes tamei, nobody can eat it. Okay,
truma becomes tamei either, right?
Right, exactly. And you can't allow truma to become tamei. On the other hand, what's a little more lenient about it is it's a single grave. It's not a base of kvaros. So a base of kvaros, a kohen is not allowed to go into altogether. And only the question was, can you go in if you take him in this box? Whereas by a grave, a kohen is just prohibited to get within, like to go over it and to get within maybe 4 amos of it. But it's not like he has to completely, be completely distant. So it might be somewhat more accessible. So let's take a look at what this says. You can make an eruv for a kohen who's tahor. Because he's tahor, he'll be able to eat the truma. If he was tamei, he couldn't eat the truma. So that would be like a sumchas problem, that he couldn't eat his own eruv. So he's tahor, and the truma is tahor, and you can do it right on top of a grave. And we're not somehow concerned that that'll make the kohen and we somehow assume that the kohen will still be able to get access to the food, and that both he and the food will remain tahor. Okay, so how is this going to happen that he can get access to this and he and the food will remain tahor? Let's take a look. So first the Gemara says, "Hey Chiyaz, how does he get to the food?" B'sheda teva migdal. Same story with this box. All right, so now he's got to it, and he could be even directly over the grave. But now we got to have the question: how does the food remain tahor, and how does he get the food off of the grave? Because as soon as he reaches out his hand from the box to grab the food, he's over the grave. The food is on the grave. So how is he going to get to the food? So the Gemara
doesn't give it to him.
Yeah, but then you could say that the whole thing by everything else before. Oh, so what's in the cemetery? Somebody else will get it.
He has to be able to get to it.
Get to it means he has to access it. Not just he has to be within a foot of it. He has to access it. So first the Gemara wants to know how the food remains tahor. Kivin de achsa itam yala. 1 minute. Since you put the food down on the grave, it became tamei. So it says b'shelo huchshara. It's food that never came in contact with water, and therefore it's not susceptible for tumah. Like it's an apple after it's been picked. An apple or an orange or whatever, something that never came in contact with water after it was picked, and therefore it can remain tahor. Because all foodstuffs only become susceptible to become tamei based on a pasuk in the Torah. It says, "Ki yutan mayim al zera, akol zera zeru asher yizareya." If water gets put onto a seed, so that all food is only susceptible to become tamei if it comes in contact with water after it's been picked. Or let's say if you shech the cow, the meat comes in contact after it's been turned into food. Not while it's a cow or while it's an apple on a tree. So here the scenario would be it never came in contact with a liquid, and therefore it could be on the grave and be tahor. 1 minute. Shenilosha b'mei peros. Or if you're dealing with bread, it was bread that was made with without any water. It was made with just apple juice, or was made with eggs, like they make egg matzah. So if you use no water, then the flour never came in contact with a liquid. So you could even have bread that is not susceptible becoming tamei if it was not made with water. Or actually there are 7 liquids, but those liquids are, but still not, there would be things that would be liquids that are not in those 7. Eggs, apple juice, orange juice, and those types of things, you could wind up making bread that would not be able to become tamei. Charlie, you want to say? Okay, fine. So that's how the food is tahor. Okay, so wonderful. So you're right over the food is tahor. Now how do you get to it? So the Gemara says, and you stick your arm out of this box to get to the food. You're over the grave. Your arm is over the grave, and you're becoming tamei. So it says, Demaisi lay. Now our version is achure by the back, which doesn't make too much sense. Rashi says the version is, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. So the Gemara says, Vehechi maisi la, 4 lines from the top. How do you get to it? How do you bring it? B'pshute kliyates, the lo makabli tuma. You have a rod, like a broomstick, that doesn't have any receptacle in it. So wooden vessels that don't have any receptacle cannot become tamei. So you stick in, if it were metal, it would be. So you stick in not a metal rod, but a wood rod, no receptacle, can't become tamei. You stick the wood rod here, like over the grave. This is my wood rod. You stick it over the grave, and you push the food towards you, and that's how you get it. So therefore, the food is tahor. You're tahor. You bring it to you, and therefore you remain tahor, and it does, and that therefore it's a good eruv. So the Gemara says, So the Gemara says 1 minute. But if you're sticking this rod over, then even if the rod does not become tamei because it's not a vessel, so it's not tamei going over, but it makes an oel. It gets the tumah, right, that comes up from the grave and goes under the rod and brings it to you. Now it's assuming that the rod is a tefach wide. Actually, we rabbinically say that even if it is a tefach in circumference, even without being a tefach wide, that actually is also considered an ohel. That's because, just as a rabbinic chumrah. So if it is that wide, anyway, so it says, even if it's not tamei, it makes an ohel and should bring the tumah to you. So here the Gemara says, you bring it, now again, our version is achure on the back, which doesn't make too much sense. So Rashi's Girsa, thank you, is achude, by the point. So the basic, So the basic idea being that it is not a wide thing. It is a pole, maybe. You could have just said the whole pole isn't a tefach, but it's a thin pole, a particularly pole that comes to a point at the edge. So if it's only the point is there, obviously there's not enough width at the top that's over the grave. Basically, the idea is you bring it with a pole that is not so wide, and therefore it doesn't become tamei. It doesn't serve as an OL, and you're able to bring it to you. So we got a perfect solution of how to get it. So the Gemara says, Ihachi, my time of Drabanan. If that's true, what's the reason of the rabbis that would disagree? Meaning, this should be a case that they should agree. So now Rashi says here, I don't understand. We had before the rabbis disagreed by a cemetery, but just but by a cemetery we said the issue was about going in this box and whether a transported OL counts as an OL. But here we're talking about a single grave, so you don't need the box. You only need the box if you want to get over it. But what you could do is, even if you can't be within 4 amos of a grave, here's your grave. You're way over here. You're allowed to be here. You're outside of 4 amos. You got a long stick. And you can bring the stuff to you. But when it's a cemetery, you can debate whether a transported OL counts, a transported box. But here,
case, we have a long knife.
Yeah, right, exactly. So here, what's the debate about? So the Gemara says, now, you could have said, interestingly, that the issue here is, I don't care that you can get the food to you. You can't get to the food. For the food to be considered your Eruv and the place you began Shabbos, maybe you have to be able to get to the food. Now, you could have to be able to be close to the food and bring it to you, but the Gemara doesn't say that. So let's see what the Gemara says the issue is about. So, Kasavi Asr Liknos Bayis Isurei Hana'ah. You cannot make your house in something forbidden in Hana'ah. You're not allowed to get benefit from a mace and from anything associated with the corpse, with the grave and anything associated with the corpse, and therefore the problem is that by putting your food on the grave, you're saying that this is where I'm starting Shabbos. This is my house. So how can you make the top of a grave into your house? You're getting benefit from things that are forbidden in Hana'ah, things that are associated with the dead. Well, the Gemara is going to get to that. So I should mention, apropos of Yom HaShoah, that there was a lot, that there were issues around, using some in the Holocaust Museum and in, I think, Yad Vashem, about some of those things that were made out of human skin by the Nazis. I'm sure people have seen those, the lampshades and those things. So how does that, getting into issues here, are there halachic problems about Isurei Hana'ah and so on? Basically, obviously, the answer was not, that it's not Hana'ah, and but anyway, but it does touch on these issues, so very appropriate for today. So let's see what the Gemara says. It says, "Ihachi my time you can't make your house on top of a grave. That's Asur and Hana." So Rav Yehuda Savar Mutter. So I don't get it. So what's the other opinion? How can Rav Yehuda say you can make your house on top of Yisurei Hana? So no, he says Kasavar mitzvahs lav lehenosnitnu. The mitzvahs are not considered Hana, and this assumes that, and we mentioned this yesterday, that you're only making an eruv for the purpose of a mitzvah. So you're making an eruv in order to get to the other city, to attend a bris or something, and therefore that's not considered to be a Hana. The ability to do a mitzvah is not a Hana. So although the grave enabled you to make this a place for your Eruv, ultimately the benefit you accrued was not considered halachically a hana, because it was only the benefit of the opportunity to do a mitzvah. And mostly, hana is seen as something that is much more physical, which, by the way, connects to the other issue I discussed. There's also questions about using dead bodies for medical experimentation and so on, and is that isurei hana? And the basic point that, like, intellectual types of benefit, educational, is not considered the hana that is forbidden. Hana that's forbidden is much more of the physical nature. So therefore, the Gemara says, so that's why it's allowed. You're only using it to help you do a mitzvah. Ella Hadam Rava. So if that's true, how about what Rava says? Mitzvahs lav lehenus nitnu. I'm sorry, that statement that Rava makes, that mitzvahs are not to drive benefit, are not considered benefit. Lema kitanai amar lishmaite. Maybe it's his position is really, would he have to concede that it's debated by Tanaim, because the rabbis say it's forbidden. So the rabbis presumably do consider it hana'ah, right? Again, what's the debate about whether you can put it on the grave? So it seems like you're saying the debate is whether that's considered hana or not. So does that mean that Rava's position that it's not hana is debated? So Rava would say to you, had people held, all the Tanaim held, you could only make an Eruv for mitzvah purposes. Everybody would say that you can put your Eruv on the grave and it's okay because the benefit of a mitzvah is not considered a benefit. This, what's the debate of putting it on the grave? This is the debate. The question is, what are you allowed to make an Eruv for? One says you can only make it for a mitzvah, so using a grave is not a problem because it's only giving you mitzvah benefit. And the other says you can make an Eruv even for, non-obligated and non-mitzvah purposes, even for, totally your own discretion. So if that's true, then you cannot use a grave because then you are getting real benefit. It's allowing you to travel, and it's not just the benefit of a mitzvah. So now the Gemara says, Ella.
Does that mean that if it's, let's say, for, I don't know, going there to get to a meal, forget about a tent of breed, just going there, then everyone would agree that you can't put it on the grave, then it's not?
Well, forget the grave. If it's not a mitzvah, then according to some, you cannot do it, because it's not l'sarach mitzvah. So you don't need the grave aspect of it.
And even though the actual point of the Eruv is considered that, it's my food, and the food is hana. In other words, going to the grave. So
the Gemara, we'll see that in a minute. Let's see what the Gemara ends. Elahadamar of Yosef, ein marvin elad mitzvah. Okay, but 1 minute. That idea that it has to be a tzarech mitzvah, that actually is not explicitly stated by the Tanaim. That's a position of Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef claims it has to be for the sake of a mitzvah. So now the way you, Rava, have framed it, everybody agrees it's not hana. Mitzvah hana is not hana. The question is, are you doing it for a mitzvah for another purpose? But Rav Yosef can't buy into that explanation, because Rav Yosef's position is, categorically, you cannot do it except for a mitzvah purpose. Hadamar of Yosef ein marvin elad mitzvah. Is he now going to be forced to say that his position is debated by Tanaim? Right? You get it? Rava says that everybody agrees mitzvah is not a benefit. So the debate of using a grave is whether you can use it for you only can use it for a mitzvah for other purposes. But the Gemara says, but 1 minute, Rav Yosef says you can only use it for a mitzvah. And the way Rava now just set up the debate, that's exactly what they're debating, whether you can use it for things other than a mitzvah. Well, Rav Yosef, if he wants to buy into Rava, does he have to say that his position is now debated by Tanaim? So Amalucha Rav Yosef would say to you, D'chulei alma ein marvin elad dvar mitzvah. I don't have to disagree with Rava. I could say, number one, everybody agrees mitzvahs are not benefit, is not considered benefit, and everybody agrees you can only make an Eruv for mitzvah purposes. So if you put those two together, what should be the problem? What's being debated by putting it on a grave? So he says, this is the debate. One says, look, once this place is kona your Eruv for you, we're going to see in a minute the use of the word kona, acquires, but once you establish your Eruv on this grave, you don't care what happens to your food afterwards. The whole point of it was to satisfy the halachic requirement, and now you're allowed to travel. So the whole benefit you got out of the grave was it allowed you to travel, and for the sake of a mitzvah, which isn't a benefit. So, kiven de kanale Eruv, you don't need the food to be protected. You only did the whole thing just to satisfy the rabbinic issue, the halachic issue. Umar Saran, the one that says it's a problem, holds Nichalei de Mintara. No, even after the grave allows you to sort sort of make an Eruv, you want it to be in that region, and you want it to be protected. Why? Because if you get hungry on your trip out to the next city, you can eat your Eruv. So therefore, you're using the grave not just to help you do a mitzvah, even after it helped you do a mitzvah by making it work for the halacha of Eruv, you're using the grave as a place to keep your food, because you're going to might want that food later. So that's what's debated. But everybody would agree that if you're just using it for the mitzvah, that A, that's the only thing you can do an Eruv for, according to Rabbi Yosef, for the mitzvah. B, according to Rava, that benefit is not considered benefit. So therefore, everybody would agree that in theory it should be okay. The only question is, are you using it for something else? Now I should say, and that's why they debate, can you use a grave? Now, if that's true, by the way, you should point out that it has nothing to do with a Kohen, right? That then those that say no, even not a Kohen, because of the problem of using a grave, which, Tosfos points out, yes, it's true, but the Chiddush was the one that says it's okay. Says okay, not just in terms of the grave and the Isur Hana, but even if it's a Kohen, and even if the food is Truma, because of the way we explained that you can get to the food. Now, I should also point out that, even if you're going to the other city for the sake of a mitzvah, let's say, I don't know, to attend a bris, while you're at the bris, you're going to have a nice meal, and you're going to see your friends, and there's going to be all these other attendant benefits. So that raises an interesting question when we say, mitzvah slav lahenos nitnu, about what happens when you get side benefit while you're doing a mitzvah. It could be that is not considered, it's a little ironic, but it could be, the mitzvah benefit halachically isn't considered a problematic as Isurei Hana, but it's powerful enough to make the stuff that's happening with it considered insignificant. So the fact that you happen to have a nice schmooze with your friends and you had a lovely meal at the bris, that's not considered to be the primary benefit. The primary benefit, because what allowed it anyway, was to allow you to participate in the bris, and that isn't considered hana. So that's an interesting issue with mitzvah slav lahenos nitnu, how it sort of can minimize the significance of other attendant benefits, and that comes up in a sugya that develops it more. Yes, Charlie.
This has been all about Eruv Techumim. You could have the same argument about
Erev Chatzeres. No, the issue about whether it's only Lidvar Mitzvah is only by Erev Techumim. I mean, Erev Chatzeres was just the general need, to general desire to, need to carry. As we were mentioning before you walked in, I actually over Sunday had the chance to see the Eiruvin exhibit at the YU Museum. And as I was seeing it, I was going through it, and it was very, interesting, all the history. And at one point I'm saying, where do they talk about the whole problem that without an Eruv, the impact that had on wives and children or whatever. And then I noticed actually that they had a whole art exhibit, an installation of somebody did exactly around that point, and they had some videos that discussed that. So the reality is that there's a certain amount in which a general Eruv is Dvar Mitzvah anyway, to give you that freedom, and that communal experience on Shabbos. But that concept of needing it with Dvar Mitzvah is only discussed by Erev Techumim. Yeah, Michael.
According to the people that say, so everyone would agree that the fact that I can eat my Eruv is not considered hana, right?
Well, the food, the eating of the Eruv is hana, but are you getting hana from the grave? So according to one, you don't care whether it protects your Eruv or not. So that's not, the fact that you happen to get hana was not something you were interested in, that was not how you were using the grave, so it wasn't forbidden to put it there, because that wasn't your intent. Okay, let's look now at the next Mishnah. So that was a quite interesting discussion of mitzvah slav lehenos and Eruv for sake of a mitzvah. We will be revisiting this issue about whether you can only do Erev Techumim for the sake of a mitzvah. And again, the point that I made, which is that even if, according to, as Tosa says, even if you don't have to be able to eat your Eruv, somebody else can eat it, it could be that everybody agrees you have to be able to have access to it and to get to it. Yes?
I don't mean to be irreverent or heretical, but couldn't you just, not put the Eruv on the grave and put it somewhere else?
I know, but the Gemara likes talking about these cases because they're fun to play with in terms of the halachic implications. Not every case that the Gemara deals with is because it was being somehow pressured by the practical relevance of the case. Okay.
If it was a nazir and the thing was in a Beit HaKerem, right?
No, because there's no problem of access. Okay. Mishnah. So now we go on to things. We said things that all foods you can use, and we discussed potentially problematic foods, truma for a non-kohen. Now we talk about things that are maybe problematic foods for anybody, but that they're still allowed to be used. You can make an eruv with demai. Demai is grain bought from an amharitz, which means somebody who's not from the chaver, this small group of people that were scrupulous about trumas and maasros. So those were people that that you assumed they took truma because even a tiny bit counts as truma, but you had to be concerned they didn't take meiser, so you'd have to take your own meiser. But you can use that for demai, even though rabbinically you have to take meiser off. You can use that demai for an eruv, even though rabbinically you have to take your own meiser. Ube meiser rishon shenat truma. So you can use meiser rishon, which is not holy. It's given to the Levi, but it's not holy. So presumably the Levi, if the Levi gave it to somebody else, can use the meiser that the truma was taken off of. Right, the truma is the holy part, and that's given to the kohen. But once truma was taken off, you can use meiser. Now that should seem relatively obvious, which the Gemara will ask. Ube meiser sheni vektir sheniftu, or meiser sheni, or something that has been sanctified, that has been redeemed, because then it is what? Yeah, I know all this is pshita, which the Gemara will ask, but then it becomes completely, it becomes desacralized. That's that word. Kohanim b'chala, and Kohanim can make an eruv with chala. They can also make it with truma. Okay, so fine. That idea that says only Kohanim b'chala suggests like sumchis that not a Yisrael. You have to be able to be the one to eat it. Ava, but what you can't use is lo b'tevel, not grain that is real tevel, biblically, that trumas and meisus hasn't been taken from it. The lo b'meiser rishon shelo not la trumaso, or the first meiser without the truma being removed. By the way, I should say not la trumaso. I think I misstated it before. Doesn't just mean the truma was taken from the original grain. It's specifically trumato, the truma of the maaser. The Leviim have to take a second maaser mina maaser, and they give a tenth of their tenth to the Kohanim. So that's called trumat maaser. So if the Levi got his maaser and has taken the trumas meiser, then it becomes completely chulin. But if he has his maaser and has not yet taken the trumas maaser, obviously it's still tevel. The lo b'meiser sheni vektir shelo niftu, and not meiser sheni have not been redeemed. Now a lot of this should seem all relatively obvious. Perhaps the only chiddush in this is the demai case, why you're allowed to use demai. I should say that the next Gemara we're going to see, pretty much the entire Gemara all the way till the next Mishnah, is almost like a sugya in Shas that gets repeated a dozen times. It's almost formulaic. This idea that the Mishnah sometimes says you can use Demai and Meiser Rishon Shenat Latumaso and Hektish and Sheniftu, and you can't use Tevel and you can't use it Shalom Niftu. That is a type of a phrase that occurs in many Mishnayot that discuss like what types of foods you can use, what type of foods do you make Birchas Hamazon over, very often it's this list. Here's the list, yes, and here's the list. No, it's exactly this list in our Mishnah, and the Gemara on it is exactly identical in all places, and discusses why you had to say these things. Aren't they all obvious? So the Gemara we're going to read is like repeated almost word for word in multiple places. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara. Demai, halo chazile. Demai, how can you use demai? You're not able to eat the demai. So the Gemara says, Migo dibai mafkilu nechsev avi ani v'chazule. Since if you wanted to, you can renounce ownership over your property, and you would become a pauper, and then you would be able to eat the mai, because the rabbis allowed aniyim to eat the mai. They weren't strict on the aniyim. So hashranami chazile, now also it's fit for you. Because in theory you could, like the Gemara before said, in theory you could undo your Naziris, right? Remember the Gemara before said, so in theory you could be an ani. Now we turn in the Mishnah, machilim es haniyim demai, you can feed the poor people demai. Ves achsanya demai, achsanya. Now you might want to say achsanya means a guest, but actually Rashi says it means like troops that are being quartered, even if they're Jewish troops. Now the phrase is interesting. It's ma'achilin, which refers to you are able to give it to them, which suggests that the primary heter we're focusing in is you're not transgressing getting benefit from giving it to the poor people. But the flip side of that is not who's giving but who's receiving. The poor people therefore are able to eat it, and therefore we infer from this that the rabbis, when they made this requirement to separate from demai, did not make it for poor people. They went easy on them, and therefore in theory it is fit for you. Amar Rav Huna, said Rav Huna, Tana, we turn the Bryce of Beit Shammai, ein machilin es admim demai, that Beit Shammai disagrees, you cannot give it to the poor, or Beit Hillel machilin es admim demai, you can. Now Tosas asks, I don't understand, why do you have to say you could become poor? Why don't we just say, since a poor person can eat it, it's a good Eruv? Okay, so one answer might be that our Mishnah sounds like it's sumchis, because our Mishnah says Kohanim can use challah. It sounds like somebody else can't. It sounds like you personally have to be able to eat it. It's not enough that somebody else can eat it. But the other answer could just be, like I said, the Gemara we're reading now is pretty formulaic. This is same Gemara appears in multiple places, so it might here have had another answer, but this is the answer it gives. Why is Demai okay? Because in theory you could become an ani. I'm sorry?
You could take truma from it and then you could eat it.
You mean you could take truma even on Bein Hashmashos? No, but he's right, because even on Bein Hashmashos you could take truma from Demai and not from... What?
Can you be mafkir your nechasim on Shabbos?
That's true. That's an interesting point. Tosfos asked that question too. That meaning, besides that, that you could, in theory, you could have. He says right there too. You exactly that point. The Tosfos the bottom Demai hachazile. So Tosfos says, why don't you just say you could be mafresh by Demai, because you're allowed to be mafresh by Bein Hashmashos. So the answers, I think, you can see there for Tosfos' answer. But what I think the answer is what I said, which is this Gemara is word for word in multiple places in Shas. So we're not, even though here there's like a more local explanation. No, the Mishnah says you're allowed to use Demai. Why is that a problem?
No, it says you're not allowed to use truma.
No, because you're not allowed to be mafresh truma Bein Hashmashos. So you can't say in theory. I mean, you mean it says you can't use tevel? Yeah, that's your question. Why did it say you can't use tevel? Why don't you say in theory you could be mafresh? Right. So that's based on the Gemara we did yesterday that you're not allowed to be mafresh. The Gemara asked that, but the basic answer is it's a good question. But the basic answer, Tosfos asked that is okay. It's more complicated. Right. Tosfos asks that one of Tosfos' answers, I should say, all right, now I'll have to give it. One of Tosfos' answers is that which we say, in theory, you could eat it, in theory, you could be mafresh and you could eat it, is only if right now, in reality, somebody else could eat it. But this is an answer Tosfos gives. But tevel, which nobody can eat, we don't say, in theory, the fact that you could be mafresh is good enough to turn it into food. A Kohen cannot eat tevel, yes? Right, a Kohen, even though it has the truma in it, it's chiyuv misa for tevel, even for a Kohen. Yes. So, okay. Okay. Anyway, so the point is that there are other answers here. First of all, it could work not like Somchis, although a Mishnah sounds like Somchis. Number two, in theory, you could be mafresh demai, like the Gemara said before. You could do that even Bein Hashmashos. But as I'm telling you, Tosfos, some of the answers to this is the fact that this Gemara is the same Gemara in multiple places. So there might be other answers here, but these answers work. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this: Ma'aser Rishon should not let truma. So how about Ma'aser Rishon that the truma was taken from it? So the Gemara says, look, tzricha, no, you need it for the following case. Pshita says, it's obvious. Look, tzricha, you need it, that the Levi came to the farmer while the stuff was still in the stalks. And he did take trumas meiser from it. That's not la trumato. The trumas meiser was taken, but the truma gedola was not taken. So basically, the Levi came to what normally happens is, you cut your wheat, you thresh it, whatever, you make it into a bundle, you bring it into the house, and after, or bring it into the barn or granary or whatever it is, and after you bring it inside, that's when it's obligated, and that's when you start distributing it, the truma and the meiser and so on, and you take it off. What happens is this Levi wanted to beat the crowds, so he came to you while you were still out there in the fields and chopping and carting it down, and he said, give me my meiser now, and you gave it to him. And the interesting thing is that although it's not obligated yet in trumas and meisers, when you give it at that stage, it still works, and it's a legitimate meiser, and you've given your meiser now. Now, because he came to you at that stage, you don't have to take truma first. You can give him straight meiser without taking truma. He has to take his 10th of a 10th. He has to take his trumas meiser from it, but you did not have to take truma. And that's the chiddush, that even though the truma gedolah was not taken, in this scenario, it's okay. Even though normally, without truma gedolah having been taken, it would still be tevel. Okay, so how do we know this works? Rabbi Yavo, like Rabbi Yavo says, Amar Reish Lakish, Amar Rabbi Yavo, Amar Reish Lakish, Meiser Rishon Shikdimo B'Shivolim Pater Mitruma Gedola. If the Levi, jumps ahead, jumps the line, and gets his Meiser Rishon while it's still in the stalks, then you are exempt from Truma Gedola. The owner can give him the Meiser without taking Truma Gedola, the main Truma. Shenemar Varimosem Mimenu Trumas Hashem. This is what it says by the Trumas Meiser, the 10th of the 10th, to the Levium. You shall take from it the Truma of God. Maaser mina maaser, a 10th of a 10th. Maaser mina maaser mardi lucha, a 10th of a 10th I sold you. For low truma gedolah of trumas meiser mina maaser, but you don't have to take truma from your meiser. So if you got your meiser early, you don't have to take truma from it. So Papa said to Rabbi, what? You mean that a Levi will never be obligated to take truma? If that's true, let's say he beat the Kohen, he jumped the line, and he got it after it had been threshed, and now that it was like in a big pile of wheat. Okay? So would we say also there? Why don't we say anytime? If you give the Levi ahead of the Kohen, he doesn't have to take truma. So he says, Amarle, Alecha Makra, no. In response to you, the pasuk says, Mikol Masrosechem, from all of your maestros, Tarimu es kol trumas Hashem, you should take all of the trumas. So yes, from your meiser, I emphasize the first mikol incorrectly, it's the second kol that has to be emphasized. From your meiser, you have to take all of the trumas, even the truma gedola. So now we have one pasuk that says that the Levi has to take truma if it hasn't been taken, and another pasuk that we learned that says he doesn't have to take it. So Umar Re'ita, what makes you distinguish between one and the other? Why in one case is he exempt from taking and the other not? High idgin v'high low idgin. One has been already considered grain and the other is not yet grain. Once it's been transformed into grain, it's been threshed and it's made into a pile and it's been smoothed over, then it becomes, then the obligations of meiser kick in. You're still allowed of truma kick in. You're still allowed to eat from it arai temporarily until you bring it into the house. But the sense is that now is when there's a chiyuv of truma. So once it's been turned into grain, then if you give it to the Levi, the meiser first, he still has to take the truma. It already became obligated in truma. But if the Levi got his meiser while it was still in the stalks before it was the grain, then it never yet get into the obligation of truma, and you can finesse that and bypass the obligation of truma. And he doesn't have to do it. Nobody has to do it. So that's when it says that you can do it for meiser, it means even meiser that was the special case that got around taking truma from it. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah is telling you. Meiser sheni v'hektish sheniftu, meiser sheni and hektish that were redeemed. So again, this is obvious. Pshita, of course, that they're totally chulid. Lo, tzricha, you need it. Shenosan as again, v'lo nosan as a chomesh. That you redeemed it with the principal cost. But when you redeem meiser sheni and hektish, you're supposed to add a fifth. It's really a quarter because after you add it, it's a fifth of the total. Anyway, you're supposed to add an additional. So you didn't. You just redeemed it with the principal cost. And it teaches you that not adding that fifth does not prevent the redeeming from happening. So it still became redeemed, and therefore it's now chulin. So that's the chiddush. Avalo b'tevel, you can't use tevel. Pshita, obviously. Lo, tzricha b'tevel tfu midrabanan. It's only rabbinic tevel. Rabbinic tevel is worse than demai. Demai has the leniencies of being mafresh, ben hashmashos, having aniyim eat it. Rabbinic tevel is treated as tevel itself. And what would be an example of rabbinic tevel? Let's say you grew it hydroponically. Well, not hydroponically. Anyway, you grew it in a pot that did not have a hole in the bottom. So it was in dirt, but dirt not connected to the ground. Okay, in pots without holes on the bottom, that is rabbinically obligated. You might also want to say you grew it like, in Eretz Yisrael Bizman Hazeh, depending on how you feel about whether the grain right now has kedushas, biblical obligated in Trumas and Maestros or not. Anyway, so when it says you can't use tevel, it means even rabbinic tevel, which is worse than demai. Okay. V'lo b'meiser sheni v'hektish shalon iftu. You can't use meiser sheni and hektish that have not been redeemed. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. V'lo b'meiser rishon shalon not l'trumaso. You can't use meiser rishon that does not have the truma taken. Pshita, of course, that's real tevel if it doesn't have the truma taken. Presumably meaning truma smaser, the 10th of the 10th. Lo, tzricha, you need it. Shiktimu b'kri v'not l'menu truma smaser v'lo not l'menu truma gedola. No, here what it means is that was a case where the Levi jumped ahead of the line, got his meiser before the Kohen, but got it, and he took truma's meiser, but he didn't take truma. Okay, and he got it though, not like the earlier case when it was in the stalks. He got it here when it was already winnowed and grain and in the pile. Okay, so I might think that maybe that would be good. Like Rav Papa said to Abaye, maybe if the Levi jumped the line, he never has to take truma. Trumas meiser he takes, but not truma. Kamash Milan Kedeshani lay. So it's telling you, like he answered him, no, that if that special exception is only when he jumped the line and it was still in the stalks. Once the stuff turns into grain, even if the Levi jumps the line, he still has to take all the trumas, not just trumas meiser, even truma gedola. And not if you haven't redeemed meiser sheni and hektish. Again, it's a pshita, obvious. Look, you did redeem them, but not correctly. Meiser shepta'o agabi asimon. Meiser, you redeemed it on a coin that did not have a image, that was not a minted coin. V'chmana amar, and the Torah says, v'tzarta hakesef, you should bind the money. Kesef sheyesh alav tzura, only money that actually has an image on it, that is a minted coin. explains. So therefore you redeemed it, but you didn't redeem it correctly. Hektish shechilo gari karka. On hektish you redeemed on land, and land you cannot use land to redeem hektish. Derchman Amar, because the pasuk says v'nosan hakesef v'kam lo. You should give the money and it should stand for him. Actually, it's not exactly a pasuk, but okay. It's a sort of like a mash of two psukim. Anyway, here the side here has the pasuk. Vim go yigalishas hasadeh hamaktisha. So yeah, it's not a pasuk. Anyway, but nevertheless, we learned that you cannot redeem. It has to be on something like kesef, and you cannot redeem hektish on land. So it's telling you if you redeem them, but you didn't redeem them correctly, then it's like they're not redeemed. Okay, Charlie always likes to point out that the problem of the drasha of Meiser Sheni that you need to do it on minted coins is that there were no minted coins in the world at the time the Torah was given. Until how many years later? 1,000 years? 500 years later?
About 500.
500 years later. Okay, but that's the power of Torah Shabbal Peh. All right, so now...
Exactly what I said last time.
I know. Okay. That's a weight. When Avram gives shekel over it's a weight of money, right? So anyway, okay. Anyway, moving on. So as I said, this Gemara. Now that you've learned this Gemara, you can commit it to memory because you can say it a few times over Baal Peh next time you see that. Anytime the Mishnah has what I know. Okay. So anyway, so that's the story. But anyway, these are the ideas that the food has to be able to be eaten. Next Mishnah. Now we move on from the types of foods, both in terms of like bread, vegetables, other things, and then the halachic status of the foods, to the question of actually placing the Eruv. And this Mishnah starts not with a simple case, but with a more interesting case of sending somebody to place your Eruv, and gets us into very interesting discussions about shlichus, about agency. So let's take a look. Somebody sends his Eruv to be placed, and he gives it to a cherish, a deaf mute, a shotes, somebody who is considered not of right mind, or a katan, a minor. So people that halachically are not considered to be bar das, considered to be people of I'm trying to think of a good sound manya, but there's got to be what's the legal sort of secular equivalent? Somebody competent, I guess. Is it competent or yeah? But what's a minor? What's that considered to be? Just not the age of majority, I guess. All right, whatever. Okay, people that are considered anyway to halachically be obligated and of the right mind. The right mind, I should say, not bardas, is because the significant part here is not that we think that the katan makes some error in judgment. The relevant part about these three is that they're not obligated in mitzvot. One because he's too young, and the other because of a question of being of enough intellect or clear, of enough intellectual ability, without getting into the problematics of cherish right now. But the common denominator is that they are not considered to be sort of halachic agents. They're not halachically obligated, or in the category of being able to do things yet halachically. Or through somebody who just disagrees with the ideas of Eruv. Interesting. Eno Eruv, it doesn't count. But if they're not the ones that are actually placing the Eruv, they're just functioning as like the mailman. They're just delivering it to the other person, and the guy at the other end is going to take it and place the Eruv. Then, Hareze Eruv, then that works, because they're not doing the significant act of making it, they're just getting it to the other guy. So let's take a look at the Gemara. The katan lo, can a katan not do it? Rav Huna katan goves a Eruv. Rav Huna says a katan can collect the Eruv. Lo kasher, it's not difficult. Kanbe ruvei tchumim, kanbe ruvei chatzeros. Difference is erev tchum and erev chatzeros. Why does it make a difference? So, because if anything, I might have been inclined to say that a ruvei chatzeros is more something that requires more of a position of responsibility of an adult to do, because you are sort of taking everybody and joining them all together and making it like the individual domains are now all one big domain. Whereas by an erev tchumim, you're just putting some food down at a certain place, and because my food is there, that's where it's like I started. That's where I started Shabbos. So Rashi says, no, that it's the opposite. That when I put my food there, we saw the phrase used earlier in the Gemara by the grave of Kona, right? Kona bias. It's like I am acquiring that place to be where I start Shabbos. So the person who puts the food down, either me or the person who does it for me, has to be like they can acquire that place for me, make that my house for Shabbos. So that cannot be done by a minor. Whereas the idea of Erev Chatzeros, look, we're all already pretty much, partners here in the, it's our joint yard anyway. So there, it's more of a formality. It's not really like creating something new, and therefore even a minor can do it.
It has to do more with the giver than the receiver, right? It's the Balabais who's giving, who is by giving it to
the katan.
Yeah, to the katan doesn't.
Right. You mean so the das of the Balabai is to transfer it.
Yeah.
That could also be true. That gets to issues exactly of das acheres makno. So that if the Balabai is, if the one who's doing the Eruv Tchumim, if the Eruv Chatzeros is giving the box of matzahs to a katan, then the person who's giving it is providing a lot of the necessary das to effect the transfer of ownership. Whereas here, it's all being done by the one who places it at the end, and therefore the adult is not involved, only the minor is involved. So that is, so that is true as well. Yes, that in one place you have more das acheres, and Rashi emphasizes you have more the idea of creating something new. Toso says it's because Erev Tchumim is more connected to a biblical idea. Since the idea, that's what you were going to say? Excellent. Okay, so he says because it's connected more to a biblical idea of Lo Yetzei Ish Min Komo, whether we rule it's biblical or not, therefore we're more strict about it. But whatever it is, a minor cannot do it here, which is not a Chiddush. The Chiddush is that he can do it by Erev Chatzeros, and we'll see more about that when we get to Erev Chatzeros. Okay, O biyad mi she'eino modeh be'erev, or through somebody who doesn't agree with an Erev. Man, who is this? Amrav Chizda Kutoi, like a Samaritan. Halachically, he's Jewish, but he doesn't buy into this whole rabbinic idea of Erev, and therefore we do not let him be considered a participant in this and an agent in this. This raises interesting halachic questions in general about how much does somebody have to sort of buy into it or be part of a category to do something. And is that an issue of shlichus? Is it a general issue of mitzvot? For example, there's a discussion whether a woman can tie tzitzis, because she's not obligated in tzitzis, although she's an adult and she's Jewish and she's obligated in mitzvos, right? How much does somebody have to be fully in the category in order to do a significant act for that, or in order to be an agent for that? Okay, and here sometimes we do talk about somebody that's like a mumar, like somebody, it's an interesting lesson. Somebody who is a mumar for bris milah and doesn't have a bris. What about somebody who just happens not to have a bris because I know hemophiliac or something? Can he be a mohel? How about somebody who's a mumar for arlus? He, in principle, didn't have a bris milah, but can he be a mo? I don't know why he'd want to, but can he be a mo? So it's an interesting question about when is somebody can do a mitzvah when they are categorically out of something, principally out of something, or just by chance happens not to buy into that whole system. So here we're saying it without comment, but it has broader implications. Yes, Charlie.
One example. A Reform rabbi shows up and he's the 10th guy in the room. Can I count him for the name?
Okay, so that could be a possible example as well. Okay, so let's take a look now at so a lot of fascinating things here which are not being elaborated on, but one we're going to focus on is the shlichus aspect. So let's take of the katan and so on. Let's take a look. But if you're asking the Cheresh not to place it, but just to transport it, and somebody else is receiving it, that's okay, because that guy then is the one that places it. So the Gemara says, how do you know? Meaning, forget halachically that they're not doing a significant act, but how do you know you can even just trust that it got done? How do you know they brought it to him? So now maybe that's a particular question because Cheresh Katan. Maybe it'll be a question about anybody. But anyway, but even if they're not needed halachically, how do you know they did the job? So, like Rav Chizda says in another context, we're saying that you saw it getting delivered. Here too, you saw it got delivered, so there's no question of knowing it got done. The only question is whether they did a halachic act, and when they're only sort of mailmen, it's not a problem. So the Gemara says, but okay, maybe you saw them giving over, but maybe the guy didn't accept it from them. Now maybe because you saw him accept it from him, but presumably it means you're not hearing the transaction. So maybe even though they gave it to the guy at the other end, he didn't agree to go ahead and now place it as an error for you. How do you know what the other guy agreed to? So, Amar Rav Yechiel, Chazaka Shaliach Oseh Shlichuso. Hachanami Chazaka Oseh Shliach Oseh Shlichuso. Okay. So Rashi ends to give because Rashi says it's a chazaka that the shliach will do what he has been, the agent will do what he's been told, and here too you can apply it. Now, which is the shliach we're referring to? So Rashi says it's the guy, the receiving guy. We can trust that he's going to do his agency and put it down, but whoever made him an agent yet. So Rashi introduces, which isn't in the Gemara, that this guy who's receiving it, you've already made this arrangement before Shabbos or whatever. You told him on Thursday, I'm going to send to you this Eruv, you'll put it down for me, and he agreed to it. Okay? So since he agreed to it, therefore you can be trusted. When he gets it from the Cherushat V'Katan, he'll do what he agreed to. So if that's true, the Gemara's question of Dilma Lo Shakyo Mine really means it has to be reread. Really the question is, maybe even though he's agreed to it, maybe he won't actually go through with it. Hard to read that into the words of Lo Shakyo Mine.
And then there's Cherushat V'Katan anymore.
Right. I know. Right. So that's true. Yeah. So it's a funny question. Anyway, the Heicha Itmad Rav Chizda Rav Yechia, where was it originally said? Aha, Itmar, the following thing. Titania, Nasno Lepio Volicho. Let's say you put it on an elephant to bring it to the guy, and the guy's going to take it from the elephant and put it down. Lakof Volicho, or onto a monkey. Okay, you might remember some statements about monkeys. Of Ein Ze Eruv. So the reason I mentioned that is because it's drawn from a Gemara. The Gemara uses this idea of elephant and monkey to describe something in which it's sort of like it's not a halachic act. It just requires getting it somewhere. You can make it into a paper airplane and throw it. It doesn't matter how it gets there. Okay, so you put it on an elephant, you put it on a monkey, and they brought it Ein Ze Eruv because nobody received it. They just brought the Amar La'acher L'Kablu Imenu. But if somebody took it off of the elephant or the monkey, Harei Ze Eruv, it is good. Now, as opposed to before it said Dilma Lo Shakil Mine, which didn't make sense, here the Gemara is framing it in a way that makes more sense. Maybe even the guy that takes it off of the elephant or off the monkey won't place it down like he's supposed to. So I'm a Rav Chizda, but Omid V'ro Ehu. I'm sorry, no, I misread it. Dilma Lo Mamtile. I'm sorry, we are back to what we said before. Maybe they won't bring it to him. Maybe you put it on the elephant and the monkey, and they didn't get it to the guy. I'm Rav Chizda. You saw that it got it to the guy. Maybe he won't receive it, which again has to be meant more abstractly. Maybe he won't do what he's agreed to do. Maybe he won't place it down. And we're going to focus on this tomorrow. This is a very important halachic issue about when can I assume, if I've told somebody to go ahead and do something, that they actually have done it or not. But right now what we're saying in the Mishnah is that a Cherushat V'Katan cannot do the important act of placing the Eruv, but they can transport it, and anybody can transport it. A monkey or an elephant can transport it, as long as an adult receives it and the adult places it down. And then the key question is going to be two. Number one, can you trust Cherushat V'Katan to have actually delivered it? And the Gemara's answer is no. You have to observe them delivering it. You have to observe it being received. But how can you trust the guy at the end, the adult, who's agreed to do it? That you can trust. So if somebody said to you they would do something, that you can trust, the Cherushat V'Katan not, and therefore that you have to observe. But an adult, yes, and we will pick up tomorrow with the issue of Chazaka Shliachos Shlichuso.